Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books presents American Tyrannies in the Long Age of Napoleon by Elizabeth Duquette. Read by Diana Blue. Introduction. Seeing Tyranny. To do all that one is able to do is to be a man. To do all that one would like to do would be to be a god. Napoleon Bonaparte. In My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, Frederick Douglass observes that Pritchard's Natural History of Man contains the head of a figure on page 157, the features of which so resemble those of my mother that I often recur to it with something of the feeling which I suppose others experience when looking upon the pictures of dear departed ones. Not only does consulting the volume provide Douglass with an image of his mother, it also supports his memory of Harriet Bailey's character. Pritchard describes Ramsay's expression as calm and dignified, a portrayal that corresponds with Douglass's recollection that his mother was remarkably sedate in her manners. Enslavement had converted the mother that bore him into a myth, Douglass concludes, but the illustration returns her to him in regal form, installing an imperial past in the place of an absence. Better, a doubly imperial one. Citing the previous passage in his introduction to My Bondage and My Freedom, James McCune Smith expands on its implications by referencing another notorious ethnographic work, Types of Mankind. The head alluded to is copied from the statue of Ramses the Great, an Egyptian king of the 19th dynasty. The authors of The Types of Mankind give a side view to the same on page 148, remarking that the profile, like Napoleon's, is superbly European. The nearness of its resemblance to Mr. Douglass's mother rests upon the evidence of his memory, and judging from his almost marvelous feats of recollection of forms and outlines recorded in this book, this testimony may be admitted. By resembling Ramses, Harriet Bailey also resembles Napoleon Bonaparte. All three are thus superbly European, surely not the conclusion the authors had intended in the book on the polygenic theory of human origin. Perhaps anticipating readerly skepticism, Smith stresses Douglass's marvelous powers of recollection, even as he adds to an already marvelous episode by linking Ramses, Harriet Bailey, and the century's most famous man. Even as the episode blurs the relationship of fantasy, history, and myth, the page numbers Douglass and Smith reference generate the effect of facticity. That other facts fuel the fantasy adds yet another layer of complexity. Napoleon had invaded Egypt in 1798, but his attempt at conquest thwarted, he abandoned his army and fled to France less than a year after his arrival. Egyptian resistance thus adds the defeat of a soon-to-be tyrant to Harriet Bailey's backstory. Were I to bracket these Egyptian reverberations, the intrusion of Napoleon in My Bondage and My Freedom would still be odd. Douglass posits that his is an American book for Americans, explicit about the horrors of enslavement. Why then make room for an emperor who tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to re-enslave the people of Haiti, and who did re-enslave many across the French Empire? As this book will demonstrate, Napoleon Bonaparte pops up in all kinds of unexpected, counterintuitive, even counterfactual ways in the 19th century United States. A young Douglass, learning to read with the Columbian orator, would have met a young General Bonaparte, pledged to a war against tyrants. First published in 1797, Caleb Bingham's Primer was organized to establish principles of elocution and republican virtue. The collection steeped Douglas in the Catonic rhetoric of freedom, in which the choice of liberty or death provided the best response to tyranny's tightening grasp. John Barnard has suggested that the orator's Catonic selections would perhaps have been for many American readers the volume's most compelling. Maybe, but there are two selections that could have bested Cato for the attention of a young boy in the 1830s. Speech of a French General to his Army, and Speech of a French General. The titles are dull, the speeches are not. Stirring exhortations by a military superstar, the speeches charge the gathered troops to rouse the Roman people entrenched in so many ages of slavery, generating through war a glorious peace worthy of their sacrifice. Calls to glory, these orations identify the French army as soldiers of liberty in Italy to break the chains of people held in bondage. If reading the orator allowed Douglas to be Cato before the Roman Senate, it also let him be Napoleon at Lodi. Douglas mentions neither speech when explaining the volume's influence on him, but they are redolent of the principles of liberty he celebrates in his autobiographies. There is a signal difference to admiring Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797, when the speeches were selected from the orator, than celebrating him in the 1830s or 1855. General Bonaparte had not yet become the Emperor Napoleon. Like many across the 19th century, Douglas seems to have toggled between the two figures. When Napoleon appears in The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 1845, he characterizes Captain Auld. At times, he spoke to his slaves with the firmness of Napoleon and the fury of a demon. At other times, he might well be mistaken for an inquirer who had lost his way. Yet, in 1846, Douglas adopts a maxim of Napoleon's as his own. Never occupy ground which the enemy would like you to occupy. A passage that draws on Bonaparte's military reputation. Even though he was opposed to everything the emperor represented, it is not hard to imagine that Douglas, the most photographed American of the 19th century, could have gleaned from Napoleon the first celebrity of the modern age, the incredible power of ubiquity. In order to see things, we must first look at them as if they were meaningless, Carlo Ginzburg advises, with a nod to Victor Shklovsky, as seemingly meaningless as a riddle. With Napoleon, that is a tall order because he was, and is, ubiquitous, seemingly able to materialize at will. My visual rhetoric notwithstanding, Napoleon survives his death in narrative even more comprehensively than in image, filling centuries with his story, his history, his sayings, his tactics in poems, treatises, tales, biographies, codes, symphonies, and dramas, justifying obliquely the promise of an early speculative narrative that imagined the miraculous future his continued presence would guarantee. Given all this material, what riddle could possibly remain about Napoleon Bonaparte? As the 20th century began, historian James K. Hosmer admitted that what Napoleon Bonaparte did in Europe we have not failed to realize, but he went on to wonder whether we have made it real to ourselves that scarcely any other human being has affected America so momentously. For Hosmer, Napoleon's influence was geopolitical. The Louisiana Territory created the conditions for national greatness, but the question he voiced about Napoleon's outsized influence on the 19th century United States resonated across subsequent decades. 50 years later, Perry Miller echoed Hosmer's claim, insisting that a volume should be written on the image of Napoleon in democratic America. In 1988, Larry Reynolds renewed this call. What these scholars suggest when they propose the necessity of a book on the image of Napoleon is the oddity of the enthusiasm evident across the 19th century United States for him. What was it about the French emperor that Americans found so compelling? American Tyrannies in the long age of Napoleon strives to answer this question, considering what Napoleon variously represented in the United States as well as the effects he inspired. People were fascinated by Napoleon Bonaparte for many reasons, but one in particular organizes this book: tyranny. If French revolutionary politics exposed latent ideological conflicts in the United States, so too did French counter-revolutionary and tyrannical politics. Indeed, American Tyrannies begins from the observation that Napoleon brings into sharp relief a basic feature of U.S. culture, one we have found various ways to ignore. Tyranny is a persistent and pervasive dimension of American life. Indeed, as Judith Schlar explains, the 19th century United States was neither a liberal nor a democratic country, whatever its citizens might have believed. From its inception, she continues, the country had embarked upon two experiments, one in democracy, the other in tyranny. Schlar was not the first to make this claim, however. In 1854, Richard Hildreth likewise observed that the American experiment is usually described as purely an experiment in democracy, but there is a second experiment, less talked about, less celebrated, but not the less real or important, to wit, the experiment of despotism. This book charts some of the features of this second experiment. As I will demonstrate, Napoleon is crucial to this project because he offered a recent model of tyranny for the 19th century Atlantic world, its new features of emergence, its relationship to democratic institutions, its effect on persons and peoples. He provided a way for 19th century Americans to explore the parameters of tyranny, particularly its relationship with liberty, while distancing them from complicity with its cruelties. At the same time, Napoleon frames for 21st century readers the idea and various practices of American tyranny, bringing its facts and its fictions into view. No one doubts that Napoleon was important to European culture, but what I will establish is that the tyrannical emperor dominated the 19th century imagination on both sides of the Atlantic. The sheer mass of material by and about Napoleon, what Celeste Langen has called a writing industrial complex as a mode of conquest, made sure he was everywhere, contributing to the belief in his magical ubiquity. Popular trompe-l'oeil prints that depicted Napoleon's shade represented and literalized this conceit. The best-known U.S. iteration, a lithograph by Currier and Ives, shows the figure of Napoleon outlined by the tree haunting his grave on St. Helena, not observable, even if magnified, unless the attention is directed to it, as Herman Melville writes in The Confidence of Man. Once one spies the figure, however, it never disappears. These curious engravings, complete with the little cocked hat, allow the emperor to emerge out of the background, from the shadows. If earlier in the century Napoleon's ubiquity was a source of anxiety, Samuel Coleridge notes a pervasive foreboding, an aching hollowness in the bosom created by a somewhat that must be kept out of sight of the conscience, some secret lodger, whom they can neither resolve to eject or retain. By its end, the conceit is the stuff of jokes. Mark Twain can thus claim to have found the lost Napoleon, the most colossal and impressive statue in the world, while cruising down the Rhone. Created from the mountains, this miles-long statue represents Napoleon himself, and not another, and there is something about the dignity and repose of the great figure that stirs the imagination and half persuades it that this is not an unsentient artifice of nature, but the master of the world, sentient and dreaming of battle, conquest, empire. Unfortunately, Twain cannot remember just where he was when he saw this statue or emperor, and thus encourages other travelers to take up the challenge of finding it again, a process that assumes the skills honed through the onslaught of trompe-l'oeil images. Twain's take on the evergreen belief in Napoleon's ability to return, from defeat, from exile, from death, plays with the problem of actually seeing someone or something who is possibly everywhere, whose ubiquity transforms him into a standard for what it means to see. One final example cements both the challenge and Napoleon's ubiquity simultaneously. An 1833 announcement in the Liberator encourages potential patrons of black painter Robert Douglas Jr. to seek out his portrait of Napoleon as a measure of the artist's abilities. If some of our Southern sham philanthropists who insist on a transportation to Africa to develop the faculties of genius in a colored man will visit the city of brotherly love, where true merit is recognized, whatever may be the garb it wears, and examine his performances, they may profit by the information they can thus obtain. If they are unwilling to go in his shop, they can see a specimen of his workmanship on a tavern sign, with a portrait of Napoleon opposite thereto. Implicit in this announcement is the assumption that readers of the Liberator would know what Napoleon looked like, no matter that he was dead, French, and adopted policies counter to the paper's own. In other words, it did not matter whether Napoleon proved angel or demon, as his ubiquity meant that he attracted attention no matter the attendant incoherence. By the end of the century, technological reproduction transformed the imperial image from a measure of skill to a source of mass entertainment. In McTeague, a vaudeville lighting artist reproduces Napoleon's with incredible swiftness, delighting the crowded theater. The incredible swiftness that has guaranteed his army's success helped to diminish the danger he represented, paving the way for the transformation of the emperor into a figure of fun, easy enough to fold into comic sketches, cartoons, and films. Napoleon at a water park. But that is not yet the experience in the 19th century. To demonstrate that people have long been involved with, indeed oppressed by, Napoleon in ways that escape notice, I'll switch registers and point out that Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida starts literally with Napoleon. One day, quite some time ago, I happened on a photograph of Napoleon's youngest brother, Jerome, taken in 1852, and I realized then, with an amazement I have not been able to lessen since. I am looking at eyes that looked at the emperor. Sometimes I would mention this amazement, but since no one seemed to share it, nor even to understand it, life consists of these little touches of solitude, I forgot about it. The photograph's effect on Bart is never explained, even though the anecdote's organizing paradox, Bart both did and did not forget about the image, is one that his study explores at length. Because he opts not to include the photograph, he guards the solitude that others' indifference inspired. Its exclusion from Camera Lucida is not unique. There are far more pivotal photographs Bart does not reproduce. Yet, in other cases, he offers an explanation, as when he notes that an image of a market of enslaved persons has been lost, like everything too carefully put away. There is no comparable explanation about the first photograph referenced in Camera Lucida. It is my fanciful intuition that Bart was unwilling to cede Napoleon any room to usurp his theoretical terrain. The photograph thus haunts the book's pages, especially as it indexes the importance of effective response. Here we see, as Fred Moten explains, historical particularity become what Bertrand Russell would call egocentric particularity. Napoleon lurks behind comparable transformations across the 19th century. Yet, as much as the historical particularity of Napoleon skulks in the background, equally consequential are the egocentric, mythic, and social particularities associated with the century's most famous man, both impossible to avoid and difficult to see. The most important Napoleonic memoir of the era, Emmanuel de la Cassis, Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène, 1823, depicts a version of the scene Bart wonders about, a man gazing at Napoleon. His head was uncovered. I was 2 steps away from him and paused to contemplate his brow. That brow where I read Marengo, Austerlitz, and hundreds of other immortal deeds. What in this moment were my ideas, my sensations? Judge him if you can. For myself, I cannot. Like Ishmael trying to read the brow of the whale, Las Casas can put neither ideas nor feelings into words. Overcome with emotion, the man who pens nearly 2,000 pages of recollections and reflections on the emperor falls silent, unable to either judge or describe. This book is, in part, an account of what it meant to people in the 19th century United States to look at and be overwhelmed by Napoleon Bonaparte. Some, although not Las Casas, understood that they gaped at a tyrant, a man who had taken the prized ideals of Enlightenment optimism and demonstrated not only the ease with which they could be twisted into oppression, but, more importantly, the prospect that oppression might be what these ideals had meant all along. Others saw a hero, the embodiment of a meritocratic ideal that was translated into a version of equality, supported in France and Louisiana by the Code Civil, the code of property based on common right. Adolphe Thiers noted in 1856 that he was constantly struck by the popularity of this terrible personage among the nations of Europe, a popularity similarly in evidence in the United States. Perhaps Bonaparte was destined, like other heroes, to become a bore at last, as Ralph Waldo Emerson puts it. But in the 19th century, his example shaped desires and ambitions, organized political and legal priorities, structured new visual and moral ideals, and offered an expansive vision of liberty and a terrifying cover for tyranny. Americans saw in the French emperor the realization of their virtues, the celebration of genius and merit, liberal values, and, to a lesser extent, its discourse of rights, and the endorsement of capitalist competition, and they were sometimes puzzled, sometimes horrified at what these dearly held principles had wrought. Victor Hugo captured this sentiment when he mused, "Angel or demon, what does it matter when you dominate our era?" Sometimes a figure for the ethical bourgeois, efficiency, codifying, organizing, sometimes the irrational adventurer, usurping, coup d'etat, assassinating. Napoleon forces a confrontation with recurrent tensions of 19th century bourgeois identity, as well as the unavoidable contradictions and pressing dangers associated with the century's most important structures: liberalism, capitalism, and the democratic state. Count Pozzo di Borgo insisted that Napoleon is destined to remain obfuscated in a sublime, gigantic shadow. Perhaps this is true, yet what this great enigma does for the United States is provide a mechanism that allows the fact of American tyranny, continuously present across the 19th century, to emerge from the shadows. You may also dispense with comparing me to God. I am willing to believe that you wrote this without thinking. The phrase is so singularly lacking in respect to me. Napoleon Bonaparte. Frederick Douglass does not write extensively about Napoleon, but he has a lot to say about American tyranny. In What to the Slave is the 4th of July, he notes that it is both easy and fashionable for people in the United States to descant on the tyranny of England toward the American colonies, a manifestation of national pride accessible to dastard and elite alike. But shared enthusiasm cannot translate these avowals into a coherent politics, as many of the enslaved, chief among them, have a contrary story to tell about tyranny. For them, it is not regulated to a storied past. To people suffering under this prolonged oppression, Douglas insists, "Your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." The organizing optimism, complete with attendant cruelties of American fantasy, is on full display at Independence Day celebrations. Arguing for the exceptionalism of American criminality rather than democracy, Douglas challenges auditors to tour the globe, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the Old World, or South America, a tour which would establish that, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. In its international as well as its domestic relations, the United States that emerges from Douglas's description is a tyranny, criminal and vicious. It is unclear whether he would have agreed with Schlar that there were two experiments in the United States. Here Douglas points to just one. At the end of Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes offers one means of parrying Douglas's charge when he claims that tyranny is a term people level against those in power, at whom they are angry, against whom they would like, illegitimately, says Hobbes, to rebel. Understanding Douglas's passage, as Hobbes would, locates it in company with other American cries of tyranny, locating What to the Slave on a continuum with John Wilkes Booth's exclamation, "Sic semper tyrannis," as he assassinated Abraham Lincoln. That Americans are almost as fond of crying tyranny as praising democracy is a topic I'll discuss in Chapter 2. This is a trivializing move, one familiar across U.S. history, which does a profound disservice to Douglas and the enslaved persons for whom he spoke in 1852, who experienced tyranny as a daily fact. Yet I will note that Americans have been willing to consider Booth's charge that Lincoln was a tyrant. The Supreme Court decision in Ex parte Milligan, 1866, is often read in this way, but Douglas's claim that enslavement provides evidence of American tyranny has, until recently, not received comparably serious attention. American Tyrannies in the Long Age of Napoleon acknowledges and cedes Douglas's premise. Enslavement is an ethical and political perversion of such a magnitude that it identifies the United States with tyranny in a fundamental way, as or more basic to the American experiment as democracy. Rather than focusing on various modes of failed democracy, how democracy expands or contracts to include or exclude persons, its radical iterations or forms of decline, its utopian potential or procedural pragmatism, the effects it inspires or forestalls, this book begins from an alternative perspective, assuming that even a qualified faith in American democracy may be a swelling vanity, that traffics in those exceptionalist modes of thinking that American literary scholars often disavow. Although the scholarship in the relationship between U.S. literature...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?